And welcome to this episode of Genesis Week, the weekly program of creationary commentary on news, views, and events pertaining to the Origins controversy. Remember, if you get lost in cyberspace, you can just punch in wazulu.com or genesisweek.com and you can find us. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel to get extras like Crevo rants and full interviews with our guests. I'm your host, Ian Juby. The past couple of weeks, we have been backlogged on some stories. The first headline story this week is one of them. Some of you will remember previous discussion about the famous fossil skeleton known as Lούσυ. When first found, everything about Lούσυ screamed chimpanzee. Its size, the bones, everything. However, previous to this find, a fossil knee had been found 2.5 kilometers away and 70 meters deeper underground. Anatomist and forensic scientist Owen Lovejoy said,
"And I knew instantly that was a human knee."
So by Lovejoy's analysis, that means we now have a human knee joint found in 3.2 million year old rock, right? Now, of course, this is not what was interpreted from the fossil find. After all, humans hadn't evolved until around 150,000 years ago, silly. That fossil is clearly too old. It can't be human, because we don't find fossils from humans in rocks that old. And so started the chain of circular reasoning that led to the fiasco known as Lούσυ. The following year, Donald Johansson's team found multiple bones from the skeleton of an ape, alleged to be our ape-like ancestor that walked. Everything about the skeleton was chimp-like. Now, it only had one upper and lower leg bone from each side, but Johansson was convinced enough that the knee found 2.5 kilometers away matched those bones, so that he used the first knee to interpret the Lούσυ skeleton as walking upright. Now, the problem was, Lούσυ's hip matched that of a chimpanzee, rather than an upright walking human. But the hip had been busted into about 40 pieces, which left a convenient open door for reinterpretation. Lovejoy took some, shall we say, creative liberties with the hip.
But all was not lost. Lovejoy decided he could restore the pelvis to its natural shape. He didn't want to tamper with the original, so he made a copy in plaster. He cut the damaged pieces out and put them back together the way they were before Lούσυ died. It was a tricky job, but after taking the kink out of the pelvis, it all fit together perfectly, like a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp's, but a lot like ours.
As a result, the angle of the hip looks nothing like a chimp, but a lot like ours. Really? You don't say. Now think about this for a second. If a creationist did something like this to a fossil reconstruction, can you imagine what the anti-creationists could say? I can hear it already. Lies! Fraud! You broke the 9th commandment. You can imagine what the evolutionists would also say, and their criticism would be appropriate. So why is it that this evolutionist gets away with it? Lovejoy was a forensic scientist, a crime scene investigator. Can you imagine what would happen if he tried to pull off a stunt like this with evidence in a court of law?
Dr. Lovejoy, could you please tell the court where you found this evidence?
We found it buried below about 70 meters or 230 feet of undisturbed ground, roughly 2.5 kilometers away from the crime scene.
And how do you know this evidence has anything to do with the crime at hand?
Because it looks a lot like the evidence at the crime scene.
And you did what to the evidence you found at the crime scene itself?
Well, we know that the defendant is guilty, see? So even though the evidence didn't point to him being the culprit, we felt that we were quite justified in taking a Dremel to modify the evidence to fit what we already knew. So, as you can see, after we scientifically altered the evidence, you'll see that it matches exactly what we were looking for at the crime scene, which proves the defendant is guilty. I say again.
He'd be thrown out of court on his keister, only slightly faster than his alleged evidence. And yet this alleged evidence is presented to school children as proof of evolution, as you can see Johansen said himself in his book, Ancestors. When Owen brings a human pelvis, a chimp pelvis, and a cast of Lucy's pelvis into an elementary school classroom, the children have no trouble deciding which two look alike. Lucy's pelvis has a bowl shape like a human pelvis, but it is not as deep. You'll also notice that when you see reconstructions of Lucy in museums, they reconstruct her with human hands and human feet. Question: look carefully at the fossil evidence and tell me how you would determine what her hands and feet looked like. This isn't science, this is imagination. Yet, primarily because of a human knee, Lucy was interpreted to be an upright walking creature. So a few years later, when a trail of obviously human footprints was uncovered in Laetoli, Africa, and dated by the evolutionary speculation as 3.6 million years old, Johansen, of course, claimed this was further proof that Lucy walked upright. Wait a minute. We just found a human knee, as well as human footprints, in rocks dated by the evolutionists as 3.2 to 3.6 million years old. That must mean humans were around then, right? We have contended for years that Lucy was nothing more than a fossil chimpanzee who could not walk upright, and that the Laetoli footprints are from a human. So now, a new analysis of another baby fossil of Lucy's type, Australopithecus afarensis, has had further study performed on it. This fossil, nicknamed Dakika baby or sea lamb, had several foot bones that the adult Lucy skeleton did not, and had intact shoulder bones, which revealed that, surprise, the bones were just like those of apes who swung from the trees and didn't walk around like humans. All the actual evidence points to Lucy being nothing more than an ape, and humans being around since the beginning. Live Science carried a well-named article, "Who didn't have sex with the Neanderthals?" Live Science contributor Charles Choi was referring to a paper that came out in the PLOS ONE journal where the researchers examined the genomes of North Africans and looked for signatures of Neanderthal in their DNA. Sure enough, they found some. Now, some of you longtime viewers will recall one of our first ever episodes, Big Fat White Neanderthal, where we examined research that showed Neanderthal DNA was rampant in almost all cultures around the world, including us white-skinned folk here in North America. Once again, the conclusion is pretty simple, and I'll emphasize it again. If we are finding Neanderthal DNA in modern humans, then obviously they bred with humans and had fertile offspring. Therefore, by definition, Neanderthals were human. There is no evolution going on here, but rather further proof that the words of Jesus were correct. Have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? The Bible is right about that. I wonder what else it is right about.